Four strategies for creative problem solving. I'm Luke Horton. Strategy one is an interesting strategy. It's called lateral thinking. Lateral thinking literally means to think vertically. Now, the way that it works is lateral thinking often relies on your ability to see a problem for what it is. So, for example, when you're solving a problem, what you're doing is you're trying to find a solution to that problem. So, for example, you operate a business and your sales begin to plummet. Your problem is you're losing sales. Say you were selling 500 of something and all of a sudden you're selling 200 of something. A non-lateral way or non-sideways way of thinking about that is that you decide to perhaps increase spending to get more sales or to increase marketing to get more sales. The problem with that is it's not lateral. Now, that's the most obvious thing. Spend more money, try and get more sales. A lateral solution would be, okay, we're losing money in this. Perhaps we need to look at the product and offer something else or add some other stream of value to it in order to increase its value. Right, the classic example in Australia is of a factory in Queensland that was selling macadamia nuts. What they did for a long time was just sell the macadamia nuts raw for about, you can buy them for about $20 a kilo here in Australia. The problem was, as soon as you took chocolate and you added it to macadamia nut, you have a new opportunity. Lateral thinking is where you take an idea or a problem and you don't use the typical way of solving it. You shift sideways and you look for ideas that perhaps are a tangent to the problem, and you add it in to try and help you make more sense of what the problem actually is. So, another example might be we look at the way in which people buy houses. One of the cases that we run in our class at Griffith University is on the housing crisis. We look at rental accommodation, and we say, well, renting in Brisbane is one of the most expensive places in the world. So what we normally ask people to do is use lateral thinking, which is the same as divergent thinking pretty much, but use lateral thinking to try and understand where the boundaries are in this particular process. So some students, for example, come up with some very good solutions. They said, why don't we create accommodation complexes, which is what the projects are in America. That didn't really work. Well, if people can't afford to rent, maybe they can share with people that have an existing house. The homestay network in Australia, for example, or people that come to Australia and can't afford to rent, people open up a room in their house and people can go and stay there. It's called lateral thinking because it uses an idea from the side, or horizontally if you like, and brings it in and adds it to the current understanding of the problem. So what we're really doing here is playing around with problem definitions. And lateral thinking is as simple as saying, what else might help us understand this problem? The thing to remember about lateral thinking, the benefit of it is, it allows you to get traction. And it allows you to ask this question. So when you're applying lateral thinking, you can ask this question. You can say, what else might be related to this problem that people haven't thought about? Or what new and interesting ideas would people have that haven't exactly been explored yet? So it's lateral because you're moving sideways within the boundaries of the problem. And you're just adding new ideas to the problem to try and enhance it. The next strategy is a little bit similar to lateral thinking, but it's called brainstorming. Now, brainstorming is often thought of, we just sit around in a group holding hands, coming up with random ideas, but it's a lot simpler than that. Brainstorming is just random generation of problem definitions. The biggest problem in workplaces at the moment is people don't really know that they're holding on to some old problem definition and trying to solve it the same way. Starting again at 5. What we often do in brainstorming is that we take every single idea that we can think of that the problem might be and we just write it down. We take all the ideas that we can possibly think of, all of the problem definitions, and we completely sketch them out. The way that we do that is that we just simply write down and express what we think the ideas might be, and we just put it all down there. Now, by doing that, it allows us to create this platform for judgment later on. So brainstorming is creative because it's just whatever it might be. This is a particularly useful technique, and one way that I use it is that when I'm faced with a difficult situation, I'll get a group of people together, like a team or a group of people, and say, all right, here's the current situation, and I try and take as much judgment out of the situation as I possibly can. So even if someone says, we need milk crates to the solution of the housing crisis, or one of my students came up with the idea of putting everyone on a houseboat, which I thought was funny, but at the end of the day, it's not really creative, and it wasn't really useful. But we didn't say that at the time. We said, all right, let's put that on the board, and the next idea. And you literally just go through every single idea that you can think of. Now, you want to do this in a team because the answer always comes in creative problem solving from outside the system, and that's the whole point of this course. If you can get that one message, then you'll be very successful in what you do. Strategy 3 is a little bit more difficult to explain. It's called dissolving a problem. We only cover it briefly in this course because in later courses we're going to talk about dealing with complex issues or dealing with critical issues. Now, dissolving a problem means you take away the tension that exists and you create a new situation where the tension can't exist. Problem dissolving is the process of dissolving the tensions that cause something to exist. It's a little bit more hard to explain because quite often in problem dissolving, it's an intuitive leap. So another way of saying it is, let's just say you're faced with a very difficult problem. In typical problem solving, you look to drill down to find the single root cause of what might be causing the issue. Now, that's not creative necessarily. Problem dissolving is the process of dissolving the tensions that exist by deliberately running towards the conflict in the problem situation. Problem dissolving, in the rental crisis accommodation example, would be where we deliberately seek out the tension. So what causes this problem? And we look at the way in which things work and we play around with the tensions. We might say it's investors versus people wanting to rent. That's where the tension is. So that with problem dissolving, you create new opportunities for solving the problem by bringing in new ideas. It's similar to lateral thinking, but it's different because it dissolves the tension. It says, look, the best thing that we can do in this situation is to try and dissolve the tension, try and get rid of that tension by creating something new. It's a mess, we can't fix it, so we just start with a clean slate. Sometimes when we dissolve problems, what we do is we remove the underlying conditions that we believe the problem is. So all problems are perceptual. So if we're getting into an elevator and we think the elevator is too slow, then a lateral solution to that might be play music to entertain people. A problem dissolving solution to that would be shift the person's attention completely away from the problem and towards something else, like putting a mirror right in front of their face so they can see it. And there's a whole heap of these strategies in Russell Ackoff's book, The Art of Problem Solving. And he's got some fables that he uses there as well. Now, problem dissolving is quite easy to do. And let's just imagine for a moment you've got two people in a room, one wants to watch TV and the other one wants to listen to music. Now, that could get into a heated argument because there's conflict there, but you can skirt around the conflict by giving one person headphones and the other person the remote. And this is what problem dissolving is all about. It's about shifting the conflicting or opposite parties onto the same page. So Gandhi did that quite well. So where there's a conflict, we want to move people to the same page. Quite often that's a new concept, quite often that's a clean slate, but quite often it's as simple as looking at the problem saying, what's the problem? Let's come up with a better solution. You don't even look at the problem, you just come up with a new solution. The final strategy for creative thinking is called concept shifting. This is a technique that myself and some other scholars, like my associate Professor Mike Metcalf, have been working on for the best part of 8 years. Concept shifting involves looking at a problem not just from a completely new angle, but completely reconfiguring the definition of the problem to being something else. Now that sounds counterintuitive at first when you think about it, but it's actually quite simple. So for example, if I'm working on a supply chain, and I'm noticing a lack of productivity, my first instinct as a manager would be, okay, these people are slack, I'm going to go and fire them. But concept shifting says, look, don't look at it as slack employees. Why don't you try this other idea of looking at the problem? So try a different idea. So this is the design approach to problem solving. Where we have a complicated issue, in problem dissolving, we move towards design by saying, look, we need new ideas, a clean slate, but we don't always get there. Sometimes we have hybrid models. Sometimes we have different models. Sometimes we just get people to agree to disagree. But in concept shifting, we come up with completely new engagements for the problem. We go back to the drawing board. We don't ignore the problem, like in problem dissolving, and say it's a mess, let's just leave it where it is. What we do in this particular strategy is we say, look, let's just come up with a different idea and see if we can get some traction. See, in lateral thinking, you move sideways within the boundaries of the problem. But in concept shifting, what you're doing is you're moving your understanding of the concept of the problem to a different understanding of the concept of the problem. But I want to iterate here. It's like brainstorming in that way, or it's really a combination of the other three, but it's like brainstorming that you move between different ideas until you find a good one. In concept shifting, you don't have time for that. You're moving between different concepts of the problem to enrich your understanding until you come up with a more holistic and complete understanding of the problem context. So in plain English, how would that work? Well, if I was doing concept shifting at work and my boss told me there's a lack of productivity, I would deliberately flip that around and say, well, given the current circumstances, how can we increase productivity? Okay, if people are slack and lazy, what can we do to turn the situation around? So if they're lazy, perhaps we need to create less management. Now that seems counterintuitive, and managers like myself wouldn't want to hear that. But that might be the way to go. Maybe we make management about facilitation. We change the concept of the structure of management rather than trying to change the employees. So the environment around them, we tweak that, we change that, and we allow them to work out how to manage themselves. If they're being slack and they lack productivity, well, we turn over the responsibility of productivity to them. And then we stop thinking about how to make people more productive, and we start thinking about ways to facilitate them managing their own productivity. Another example that I've done recently in problem solving was looking at people not using information systems in a supply chain. The problem was this company had spent $100 million on this huge information system. So that's huge amounts of money. And people weren't using it. Simple problem, right? The thing is, it covered the entire workflow of the organization. Or in other words, everybody that used a computer in that organization had to engage with this computer. Now, a lot of people did, but a lot of people didn't. And the ones that didn't engage were in this tiny little group that were mission critical. So this was a steel rail business. So steel's coming in from South Australia, and these people had to catalogue it and store it and then use it when they needed it. What they were doing was not using that system. They were bypassing it, duplicating the workflow. Now, the management team, their first response was crack down. Let's crack down on it. Let's get down there and tell them what to do. The more they cracked down, the more these people began to hide their practices from management. So what happened to solve this issue? They changed their concept. They said, no, it's not about them being slack, lazy, or stealing. It's about them not knowing. And they completely chose to take a different tack. And they hired someone to go around and train each and every person one-on-one how to use the system. That was the first part. So this guy spent 18 months in the business, going to each desk, telling people, look, yes, this is something you need, this is something that works, this is something you can do, and this is something that works very well. And, you know, if you use the system, it'll improve the way you do work and you'll have more time. So they sold the solution to them. So they changed the concept from being about a lack of productivity and cracking the whip to being about using different ideas about training and making it about soft style training. Now, as time went by, advocates naturally came out of this process, and the advocates became a little community. So the community began to train new users to use the system and say, look, it's actually not as bad as we thought. Over a period of time, several $1 million were recovered from that business through this process. And all they had to do was look at the problem from a completely different concept. So it's not a lateral shift, it's a different idea altogether. This process is simple. You just walk into the situation, you look at the current definitions, and then you deliberately pick alternative ones and completely different ideas that you might think are useful. In closing, I warn you about this last one. This is genuine creative problem solving. You can do this right now. You can go back to your workplace or whatever it is you're doing, running a community garden. If you're faced with a difficult issue, stop trying to drill down and solve the problem from your current understanding. Get someone from outside the system to come in and say, what do you think my problem is? You'll be pleasantly surprised how well that works in solving problems.